Silence can be louder than a scream. On the day Taylor Wright vanished, the Florida air felt heavy, unmoving, almost watchful. There were no shattered windows, no frantic 911 call, no dramatic struggle caught on camera. Just a quiet gap where a woman used to be. One moment she was there. The next, she was gone. Taylor was not careless. She was not naive. She was a former police officer, trained to see what others missed. She understood patterns, body language, lies hiding behind steady voices. She had worn a badge. She had faced danger. She knew how quickly trust could turn into threat, which is why her disappearance didn't make sense. When her phone stopped ringing, when texts went unanswered, when plans were ignored, the people who knew her felt it in their bones. Something was wrong. Taylor had structure, routine, discipline. She didn't just vanish without a word, especially not in the middle of a stressful legal battle involving custody issues and a significant amount of money. She had been fighting hard for her future, for stability, for control over her life. And standing beside her through all of it was someone she trusted completely. Her best friend. They had shared laughs, secrets, long conversations about fear and hope. This was the woman Taylor leaned on when the court hearings grew exhausting. The woman who reassured her when anxiety crept in at night. The one who claimed to protect her, to defend her, to stand guard when the world felt hostile. Trust like that isn't casual. It's sacred. But sometimes the person closest to you knows exactly where your armor is weakest. In the days after Taylor disappeared, her best friend spoke with calm certainty. She told investigators there was nothing to worry about. Taylor just needed space. She was overwhelmed. She would resurface soon. Her voice didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't waver. Too calm. While others panicked, she steadied the room. While family members feared the worst, she dismissed the concern. She reassured everyone that Taylor was strong, independent, capable of disappearing for a few days if she needed to clear her head. But the silence grew louder. Behind that calm exterior, investigators began pulling at threads. Phone records, text messages, bank statements, small details most people overlook. And those details began whispering a different story. There had been tension, financial tension, a large sum of money entrusted between friends, hundreds of thousands of dollars that had moved quietly without much documentation, loans, promises, verbal agreements built on trust instead of contracts. Money has a way of exposing cracks. Friends described subtle changes, shorter tempers, conversations that ended abruptly, an edge where warmth used to be. Taylor had started asking questions, direct ones. She wanted clarity about where her money was. She wanted transparency. And transparency can feel threatening to someone with something to hide. The night she disappeared, Taylor met with her best friend. It was supposed to be simple. A conversation, a resolution, maybe even closure. After that meeting, Taylor was never seen again. No confirmed sightings. No verified phone activity. No proof of life. Just silence. Investigators replayed the timeline again and again. That meeting became the center of everything. The final known contact. The last person to see her alive. Her best friend maintained composure. She prayed publicly for Taylor's safe return. She stood before cameras. She comforted worried relatives. She appeared like a pillar of strength. But composure can be rehearsed. Detectives noticed inconsistencies. Small ones at first. A time that didn't align. A statement that shifted slightly from one interview to the next. Deleted messages. Financial transfers that seemed urgent, almost desperate. Nothing explosive. Just cracks. And cracks grow. Taylor had been in a relationship. There had been custody tensions. Emotional strain. Rumors of personal conflict. It looked, from the outside, like a complicated domestic situation. The kind that investigators often see spiral into chaos. But chaos usually leaves evidence. This felt different. This felt controlled. Behind closed doors, questions deepened. Why was there no sign of struggle? Why was her vehicle untouched? Why did her digital footprint stop so abruptly after that final meeting? And why did the one person closest to her seem more focused on calming the narrative than searching the woods? Friends began to feel uneasy. The way she spoke about Taylor shifted subtly. Less urgency, more distance, almost as if she was preparing the world for the possibility that Taylor wasn't coming back. Absence changes people, but guilt changes them faster. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere thickened. Reporters started circling. Headlines asked questions no one wanted to say out loud. The phrase foul play began appearing more often. And still, the best friend stood firm. She insisted on loyalty, on love, on the depth of their bond. But loyalty does not erase evidence, and love does not silence suspicion. Somewhere beneath the prayers and interviews, beneath the steady voice and folded hands, something darker lingered. A fear that wasn't about losing a friend, a fear of being exposed. The idea was almost unthinkable. Best friends don't harm each other. They protect, they defend, they stand in the gap. But history tells a different story. Some of the most devastating betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from inside the circle. As investigators leaned harder into the timeline, one fact refused to fade. Taylor trusted her enough to meet her alone, to have one final conversation, to believe that whatever tension existed could be resolved face to face. Trust is powerful like that. It lowers defenses. It softens instincts. It convinces even a trained officer that the person across from her means no harm. And that is what makes betrayal so lethal. Because when danger wears the face of friendship, you don't see it coming. You open the door. You sit down. You talk. And sometimes, you never leave. The silence that filled the Florida air that day wasn't empty after all. It was waiting. Waiting for the truth to rise. Waiting for secrets buried beneath loyalty to surface. Waiting for one word to shatter the illusion forever. Friendship, loyalty, betrayal. Only one would survive. And as suspicion slowly tightened its grip, a single question echoed through every interview room, every headline, every sleepless night. Was her best friend desperately searching for her, or carefully hiding what she had done? The truth doesn't explode all at once. It creeps in, quiet, patient. And in Taylor Wright's case, it began with something small, a signal from a cell phone that refused to lie. The investigation didn't start with flashing lights or dramatic arrests. It began in silence. Detectives sitting at desks, screens glowing in dim rooms, coffee going cold as they replayed Taylor's final hours again and again. Phone pings, surveillance footage, bank statements, text logs, patterns. Taylor had vanished, but her digital life hadn't. It left behind footprints, tiny impressions in the sand. And when investigators lined them up, they didn't see panic. They saw calculation. Taylor had been in the middle of a financial dispute. A large amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, had been entrusted to someone she believed she could trust completely. Her best friend, not a business partner, not a stranger, a best friend. The money was supposed to be safe, protected, held temporarily during legal battles and custody disputes. But as weeks passed, Taylor began asking questions. Direct ones. She wanted proof. She wanted documentation. She wanted transparency. And that's when things changed. Friends later described arguments. Not explosive, not violent, but tense. Conversations that ended too quickly. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. The warmth between them cooling slowly. Loyalty can blur warning signs. It convinces you that discomfort is temporary, that misunderstandings can be fixed, that the person who stood beside you yesterday would never harm you tomorrow. But money tests loyalty, and secrets poison it. While Taylor pushed for answers, her best friend held her composure in public. She gave interviews, her voice soft but steady. She prayed for Taylor's safe return. She stood before cameras and spoke about hope. She looked devastated, but detectives are trained to look beyond tears. When they compared her interviews, something subtle shifted. The timeline changed by minutes, then hours. Small details were rearranged, words adjusted. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. Why did her story evolve? Why were certain messages missing from Taylor's phone? Why had financial transfers occurred just days before the disappearance? The questions multiplied. Investigators dug deeper into bank records, Money had moved in unusual ways. Withdrawals, transfers, payments that seemed rushed, almost desperate. And then came the digital trail. Search histories don't have emotions. They don't pray. They don't pretend. They record. Suspicious searches appeared. Location data placed phones in areas that didn't match public statements. A timeline formed, a cold, precise map of movements and decisions. And that map told a different story. The woman who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Taylor now stood under a microscope. Every word she spoke was examined. Every tear analyzed. Every pause questioned. At first, she remained composed, calm, cooperative, but pressure is relentless. Detectives asked the same questions in different ways. They circled back. They waited in silence after answers. Silence can be powerful. It stretches. It exposes nerves. And slowly, the cracks widened. Her explanations grew more complicated. What had once been simple now required clarification. What had once been confident now sounded rehearsed. Behind closed doors, investigators compared notes. The pattern was tightening. Financial stress, mounting debt, the risk of exposure if Taylor demanded her money back publicly. Motive was taking shape, and motive changes everything. What if this wasn't a random disappearance? What if it wasn't a domestic conflict or an impulsive act? What if it was planned? The thought settled heavily in the room. Because planning means intent, and intent means betrayal. The investigation expanded outward. Associates were interviewed. Relationships examined. Detectives learned about personal struggles, marital strain, financial burdens hidden beneath appearances. The pressure of keeping up an image while cracks spread beneath the surface. To outsiders, the friendship looked solid, supportive, loyal. But beneath it lay something darker. Resentment, fear, desperation. When someone feels cornered, financially, emotionally, socially, they don't always run. Sometimes they calculate. Sometimes they convince themselves there's only one way out. As the digital evidence stacked up, one truth became impossible to ignore. The timeline didn't align with innocence. The last confirmed meeting between Taylor and her best friend now looked less like a conversation and more like a turning point. Investigators imagined the scene. Two women sitting across from each other. Years of friendship between them. One asking for answers. The other feeling walls close in. Voices rising. Accusations forming. In that moment, something irreversible may have shifted. Because when trust breaks under pressure, it doesn't shatter loudly. It fractures quietly. And sometimes, that fracture leads to something unthinkable. As days turned into weeks, the public image began to fade. The interviews slowed. The prayers became less frequent. The confident posture softened into visible strain. Behind the tears, behind the carefully chosen words, there was fear. Not the fear of losing a friend, but the fear of being discovered. Detectives could see it in the eyes, in the delayed responses, in the way answers were shaped to avoid specifics. The mask was slipping. The question was no longer whether something had happened. It had. The real question was who had made it happen, and why. The evidence was building towards something heavy, something devastating. Each record, each deleted message, each unexplained movement added weight to a truth. The verdict came down in a room so quiet you could hear someone breathe. After months of headlines, testimony, and whispered speculation, everything narrowed to a single word. One word that would decide whether betrayal would finally meet justice. Guilty. But before that word landed, the courtroom had already become a battlefield of truth and deception. The trial drew national attention. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters spoke in hushed tones about loyalty turned lethal. Inside, the air felt heavy, charged. Like everyone present understood, they were witnessing something deeper than a crime. They were watching the autopsy of a friendship. Prosecutors stood before the jury and told a story that chilled the room. They spoke of greed disguised as devotion, of a calculated plan born from fear and a financial desperation. They described how money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, became the silent wedge between two women who once trusted each other with everything. They painted a picture of a friendship that slowly rotted from the inside. Taylor had asked questions. She wanted accountability. She wanted her money back. And in doing so, prosecutors argued, she threatened to expose lies that had grown too large to manage. So instead of confessing, instead of facing consequences, her best friend chose silence. Permanent silence. The courtroom screens lit up with digital records, bank transfers, phone pings, deleted messages, each piece small on its own. Together, overwhelming. The timeline unfolded step by step, minute by minute, leading back to that final meeting. Then came the witness who changed everything. The man who had dug the grave. His voice trembled as he described being hired, paid in cash, told to prepare a burial site on remote property. He spoke of quiet trees, of soil turned under indifferent skies. He admitted he didn't ask enough questions at first, until it was too late. You could feel the shift in the room as he testified. Some jurors avoided eye contact. Others stared forward, unmoving. The weight of the story settled on every shoulder. The defense fought back. They argued doubt, suggested manipulation, claimed their client had been misled, that others were responsible, that grief and suspicion had created a narrative too easy to believe. They questioned the credibility of witnesses, highlighted inconsistencies, tried to chip away at the prosecution structure. But the evidence didn't bend. Financial records confirmed motive. Digital footprints confirmed movement. Witness testimony confirmed planning. The layers of the story aligned too precisely to dismiss. This wasn't chaos. It was calculated. As closing arguments ended, the courtroom fell into a waiting game. The jury filed out. Hours passed. The silence stretched thin. Taylor's family sat together, hands clasped. Their faces carried more than grief. They carried betrayal. Because murder by a stranger is horror. But murder by someone welcomed into your home? That is devastation. When the jury returned, the sound of their footsteps echoed. 12 ordinary citizens about to deliver an extraordinary judgment. The foreperson stood, papers in hand. Guilty. The word didn't shout. It didn't need to. It landed like a stone in water, sending ripples through everyone present. Taylor's family broke into tears. Some wept openly. Others bowed their heads, shoulders shaking quietly. Years of pain condensed into one fragile moment of validation. Across the room, the woman once described as a loyal best friend stood motionless. No interviews now. No cameras to reassure. No public prayers. Just consequences. The judge's voice was steady as the sentence was read. Life in prison. No parole. No second chances. A lifetime measured in steel bars and concrete walls. The same silence that began this story returned to the courtroom. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't the silence of mystery. It was the silence of finality. Taylor's life could not be restored. Her laughter would not return. Her dreams would remain unfinished. Justice does not rewind time. It only draws a line between truth and denial. Outside the courthouse, the world kept moving. Cars passed. Phones hung. People hurried to work. But for those who followed the case, something lingered. A warning. Because this story was never just about money. It was about trust. Trust is powerful. It binds families. It builds friendships. It creates partnerships. But blind trust, unchecked, unquestioned, can become dangerous. Evil does not always announce itself with violence. It doesn't always look cruel. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it comforts you during hard times. Sometimes it stands beside you in court. And sometimes it calls you best friend. The Taylor Wright case forces an uncomfortable truth into the light. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. It often grows quietly within the circle of loyalty. It feeds on secrecy, on fear, on desperation. And when pressure builds high enough, it can turn affection into calculation. In the end, the courtroom delivered justice. But justice doesn't erase the deeper lesson. Know who stands beside you. Not just when life is easy, but when money is involved, when secrets are shared, when accountability is demanded. Watch how people respond to pressure. Watch how they handle truth. Because character is revealed not in comfort, but in crisis. As the courthouse doors closed and the headlines slowly faded, One question still lingered in the air. How many warning signs had been overlooked in the name of loyalty? How many red flags were dismissed because love felt stronger? Taylor's story does not end with a verdict. It continues as a cautionary echo. Friendship is sacred, but trust must be earned, protected, and sometimes questioned. Because the darkest truths do not always hide in distant shadows. Sometimes they sit across from you at the kitchen table. Sometimes they hold your secrets. And sometimes they wait for the moment you ask too many questions. The silence that began this story never truly disappears. It lingers. A reminder, a warning, and for those willing to listen closely, a lesson that could save a life. The room held its breath. 12 strangers sat in a wooden box, holding the weight of a life in their hands. Across from them, a woman once called best friend stared forward, face still, eyes unreadable. And somewhere in that silence, the truth waited to be spoken out loud. The trial had drawn national attention. News vans lined the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered into microphones about loyalty turned lethal. But inside the courtroom, there was no spectacle, only tension, thick and suffocating. Prosecutors stood before the jury and told a story that felt almost impossible to believe. Not a crime of passion, not a sudden burst of rage, but something colder, calculated, planned. They spoke of greed dressed up as friendship, of trust used as camouflage, of a woman who feared exposure more than she valued loyalty. Taylor had trusted her, shared money, shared secrets, shared the kind of bond people believe is unbreakable. But when financial pressure mounted and questions grew louder, that bond became a threat. The prosecution laid it out piece by piece. Financial records projected onto a large screen. Transfers, withdrawals, amounts that didn't add up. Digital footprints mapping movements the night Taylor vanished. Deleted messages that investigators recovered anyway. Each detail small on its own. Together, devastating. Then came the witness who shifted the room. The man who had dug the grave. He walked slowly to the stand, eyes low, voice unsteady. He described being approached, paid in cash, given instructions to prepare a burial site on secluded property. He admitted he didn't ask enough questions at first. He said he trusted the explanation he was given, until he realized what he had helped hide. As he spoke, some jurors swallowed hard. One looked down at her folded hands. The reality settled like dust over the courtroom. This wasn't theory anymore. It was flesh and bone. Soil and silence. The defense tried to unravel the story. They argued doubt, suggested their client had been manipulated, claimed the witness had reasons to lie. They spoke about grief, about confusion, about how easy it is for suspicion to grow when someone disappears. They tried to plant seeds of uncertainty, but the evidence stood firm. Every time doubt was raised, another document appeared, another timestamp, another witness confirming a timeline that led back to one person. The woman who had once stood beside Taylor in court during custody hearings. The woman who had prayed publicly for her safe return. The woman who had told reporters she was devastated. Now she sat beside her attorney, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her composure was different now, quieter, less confident. The mask she had worn in interviews was gone. In its place was something harder to read. Fear, or perhaps realization. As closing arguments ended, the courtroom grew still. The jury filed out to deliberate. Hours passed. The clock ticked loudly against the wood-paneled walls. Taylor's family sat together, barely speaking. Their grief was layered. They mourned her absence, her laughter, her unfinished plans. But they also mourned something deeper. The betrayal. Because murder by a stranger is horrifying. But murder by someone you trusted with your life? That leaves a wound that never fully closes. When the jury returned, everyone stood. The shuffle of feet echoed. The foreperson held a folded paper. For a moment, it seemed like time itself hesitated. Then the word came. Guilty. It didn't sound loud. It didn't need to. It cut through the room like glass. Taylor's mother covered her mouth, tears falling freely. A sibling leaned forward, shoulders shaking. Years of waiting, of not knowing, of fearing the worst, now replaced with certainty. Justice had a name. Across the aisle, the woman once called best friend blinked slowly. No outburst, no dramatic collapse, just a quiet stillness as the reality settled in. The judge's voice followed, steady and final. Life in prison. No parole. No second chances. A life behind bars for taking a life that could never be restored. In that moment, silence returned to the courtroom. The same kind of silence that filled the Florida air the day Taylor disappeared. But this silence was different. This one carried consequence. Outside, the world continued. Cars drove past the courthouse. People checked their phones. Life moved forward. But inside that room, something permanent had shifted. The story was no longer about suspicion. It was about truth. And truth, when it arrives, often reveals something uncomfortable. Evil does not always wear a frightening face. Sometimes it smiles in photographs. Sometimes it stands beside you at your wedding. Sometimes it reassures you when you are afraid. Sometimes it calls you best friend. This case forced that reality into the open. It showed how easily trust can be weaponized, how financial desperation and fear of exposure can twist loyalty into something unrecognizable. It reminded everyone watching that character is not proven in calm seasons. It is revealed under pressure. When Taylor asked questions about her money, she was asking for accountability. She believed honesty would follow. Instead, she uncovered something darker. And that darkness chose silence over truth. The courtroom delivered justice. But justice does not erase the lesson. Trust is powerful. It builds homes. It builds friendships. It builds futures. But blind trust, unchecked, unquestioned, can become dangerous. The people closest to us hold the most access. To our secrets, to our routines, to our vulnerabilities. And sometimes, that access becomes temptation. The Taylor Wright case is more than a crime story. It is a warning written in quiet letters. Pay attention to small shifts, to inconsistencies, to the way someone responds when confronted with truth. Watch how they handle pressure. Because the darkest betrayals rarely begin with violence. They begin with small lies. As the convicted woman was led away in handcuffs, cameras flashed again. Headlines would soon fade. New cases would fill the news cycle. But for Taylor's family, for those who followed the story closely, the echo remains. A simple question that lingers long after the verdict. How well do we really know the people we trust most? The silence that began this story did not disappear. It transformed into a warning, into a lesson, into a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger is not the stranger outside your door, but the friend already inside.